On today's Locked On Jayhawks preview of the Champions Classic game for KU against Michigan State.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio, and this is Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for making it your first listen every day. Thank you to everydayers catching each and every show. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find us on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. On today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks, we're going to be breaking down the Kansas-Michigan State matchup. We're going to get into the top headlines of the game, Michigan State scouting report, matchups of the game, players to watch, and plenty more on today's episode of LOJ. First, we are brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, where you can make every moment more, and you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. Kansas takes on Michigan State. It's the early game for the Champions Classic on your Tuesday, and we get into our headlines here. Well, the first one has to be Tom Izzo versus Bill Self. Anytime you get two legendary, very well-accomplished coaches in their profession going at it against each other, that certainly adds some intrigue to the matchup, and that's exactly what you have with Bill Self against Tom Izzo. This is a matchup where the coaches have met obviously several other times in just the Champions Classic event alone. You can certainly think back to some positive memories, some negative memories in this series as well. You can think back to the NCAA tournament matchup that occurred between these two in 2017, in which Kansas earned a second round victory. You think like Frank Mason, like screaming into the chest of Miles Bridges, which I guess that one turned even better for the side of Frank Mason there. But anyway, you also have the game that I think of like from the negative standpoint, the Champions Classic game from would that have been 2015 Champions Classic for the 15-16 season, I think, when Kansas was up a decent amount and Michigan State came back, ended up winning the game. That was the year Denzel Valentine won like National Player of the Year, him and Buddy Hield, like one like the AP and one like a different award. I don't know, whatever. But yeah, there's plenty of them. And obviously the last time these two met in the Champions Classic, you have the season that Kansas won the national title in 2022. It was the 2021 Champions Classic for the 22 season, and that was the game that Ochai Agbaji announced to the college basketball world that he was going to be an All-American candidate, dropped nearly 30 points in the game, and Kansas, the rest is history. Well, Kansas would hope for something similar here to be able to point back to in the Champions Classic this go-around. Other headlines coming into this game, you have two teams looking to move to 3-0 on the season. It's a little different. Now, Kansas got to 2-0, then Michigan State, who played Monmouth and Niagara, who are both outside of the top 250 on KenPom. For Kansas, both their teams they've played are top 250 on KenPom, though I wouldn't really put too much stock into Kansas' first game. It's more so about their last one in the win over North Carolina. So those are big headlines coming into this one. And then I think just in general, when the Champions Classic happens, I know it wasn't the official start of the college basketball season, and there's been other big games, including KU's game against North Carolina. But for I think a lot of people, this is the tip-off event that feels like the start of college basketball season for I think the general fan. And that, I don't know, maybe for the general fan, it's more of the like tournaments that happen during Feast Week. But still, I think that it's always a big deal, the Champions Classic every year. So when you look at Michigan State, they're 2-0 on the season. Like I said, they had wins against not great teams, but they did blow them out, which you're supposed to do if you're going to be much better than them. Monmouth is ranked 266th on KenPom. They beat them 81-57. Niagara is ranked 328th. They beat them 96-60. So no trouble there with either of those teams. Currently, KenPom has Michigan State as basically being in the mid-30s. Overall, they are basically just outside the top 50 on the offensive side of the basketball, and then on the defensive side of the ball, viewed as like a top 15, top 10 defense on KenPom. So certainly that makes you think this will be more of a defensive first team as opposed to playing North Carolina, who is more of an offensive first team. So different challenges between these two. When you look at Michigan State, they went 20-15 last season, made it to the second round of the NCAA tournament. They brought back just one starter from that team, so a lot of new faces. But there are a lot of role players who were back from the bench of last season that turned into bigger roles this year. The one starter they brought back is Jaden Akins. He is a 6'4 guard, I guess you could say guard wing type. He's had a great start to the season. 16.5 points per game, 7.5 rebounds, average double-digit points per game last year. He's only 1 of 7 from 3 this year, but he is shooting 57% from the field to this point in time. 2 other players back who were McDonald's All-Americans but didn't have huge seasons last year. One of them was Jeremy Fears, who was like shot last year. So good to see that he's back in action. And he showed some good flashes last year when he played before the injury. He ended up having to get surgery because of that. So again, great comeback story for him. He's averaging 8 assists per game. He hasn't been a big scorer yet. So he's more of the DeJuan Harris mold of being that pass-first defensive point guard. And then Xavier Booker was their other All-American who, played sparingly off the bench last year. So far this year, hasn't quite rolled yet. 5.5 points per game, 3.5 rebounds per game, just 29% from the floor. Not great for a big man, but he went off during their international trip. Like he had 19 points in the first half of their first game of their international trip over the summer. So we'll see if that clicks together for him. They did add Frankie Fiddler in the transfer portal, 20 points per game at nearby Nebraska Omaha. He's a good wing shooter when he's playing right. So far, 10 points per game for him, but he hasn't shot it well. Interestingly enough, there actually were a couple matchups with Fiddler and Zeke Mayo for Kansas when the two of them were in the Summit League, because both of them were all Summit League a season ago last year. And in the two matchups, both of them played very well. Fiddler had 23 points, 9.5 rebounds per game in the two matchups. Mayo had 21.5 points, 7.5 rebounds, 4 assists per game in those two matchups. Then when you look at the center position for them, Booker will play some center, but also Simon, I don't know if that's the proper way to pronounce the first name, Zapala. He is a transfer from Longwood in Utah State, 7-footer, good touch around the rim. He has been splitting center duties with Jackson Kohler, who's had a nice breakout start to the year. 6'9", 245-pound big man, averaging 12.5 points, 10.5 rebounds. And then Carson Cooper, who's kind of just a big body, 6'11", 245 that they've thrown in there here and there. Jace Richardson is a top 40 recruit they brought in. Might recognize the last name. He is the son of Jason Richardson. And he's had a good start to the year. 11 points per game, 67% from the floor. Also look out for Trey Holloman getting wing minutes, good shooter off the bench, and Cohen Carr as well. They will play a lot of two big basketball with Michigan State. So in the way that North Carolina certainly stressed and stretched KU by playing KJ and Hunter Dickinson with the way that they played and shot threes and ran ball screens and had guard play, Michigan State's going to run more two big basketball. So from that standpoint, maybe it's a better stylistic matchup for KU. So according to Ken Pom, 43% of Michigan State's lineups so far this season have featured two bigs in there. And when I say two bigs, Booker, Zapala, Kohler, Cooper. It's basically featured half the time almost two of those four guys in there at the same point in time. And when you look at what they've done well early on in the season, they're grabbing offensive rebounds at a high rate. They're shooting over 60% on 2-point shots to this point in time. The offensive rebound rate is over 43% right now, which is very, very good if they can keep that going. They're getting to the free throw line a decent amount to this point in time. They're doing a decent job at avoiding turnovers to this point in time. They haven't shot it a ton from three, nor have they shot it well. They've done a good job with getting assists so far this season. And then on the defensive side of the basketball, when you play two big basketball, you expect to be a good rebounding team, expect to be a good 2-point defense. Well, they've done both those. They're top 80 in the country in defensive rebound rate early on. Teams are only shooting 33% on 2-point shots against them, which is 32.8% on twos, 32.1% on 3-point shots. But they are giving up a lot of 3-point attempts so far, you would kind of expect based on how they play. As far as the importance of the game for KU, it's just looking to string together momentum. You got the big win over North Carolina. Don't have a setback in this one. Keep the momentum building forward. This is one that you're more expected to win. I guess you could say maybe the point spread's not quite there because you didn't have Allen Fieldhouse, but this is one that, continue to show how good of a team that you are. Go out and win this game and kind of flex your muscle and build that early season momentum if you're KU. Let's get to our matchups of the game. We also got players to watch that next on Locked On Jayhawks. Our episode today is brought to you by Roy. And Locked On Jayhawk fans, listen up. You need to download the Roy app. You have heard us talk about Roy this season and how they are revolutionizing the NIL industry. Roy allows you, the fan, to have a say in who gets the NIL money. And here's what I absolutely love about Roy. You get your money back if that player transfers. Roy's helping us keep our team intact, and it's actually good for the game long term. You can look back to the season and think about some of the great performances by KU basketball, KU football over the course of the year. Well, this week, we decided to give a little coin to J.B. Brown. J.B. Brown had 10 tackles. 7 of them were solo. He had the big 4th down stop to really keep the momentum going for KU and their defense. And you too can show support for J.B. Brown by depositing a little appreciation onto that player's account. To do that, download the Roy app. You can see what the logo looks like if you're watching on YouTube, or go to joinroy.com. Now let's spotlight that Roy Locked On Player of the Week. Again, J.B. Brown had those 10 tackles. He was excellent for KU, constantly filling against the run, constantly laying his body on the line, constantly throwing big hits out there. And we're going to throw some money into his account on Roy. Every contribution counts, 10, 20 bucks. It all adds up, and it's going to help your favorite players stay put. Join me and show some love for J.B. Brown. Download the Roy app or get to joinroy.com today. Use promo code Locked On. Every athlete from every team is there. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited. Go to joinroy.com for full terms. Roy, support the players. Change the game with Roy. Continue on matchups of the game for Kansas and Michigan State, and we will have a postcast after the game. Obviously helps that it's the early game for whatever happens, recapping the game between KU and Michigan State. So make sure you're subscribed to the show. Don't forget you can check out the recaps from the Carolina game, for the KU football game against Iowa State right here on our channel as well. All right, number one matchup for KU and Michigan State is the interior presence. This is kind of a vague way of putting it, but Michigan State has one of the lowest three-point attempt rates in the country right now. Nor have they knocked them down at a very good clip. Right now, they're well outside the top 300 in terms of three-point attempt rate per field goal attempts. They're only shooting 25% on three-point shots to this point in the season. They play a lot of two-big basketball, so you would expect that a little bit. They do score inside at a very good clip. They play physical. They rebound. They stop inside shooting at the other end. They're shooting 72% at the rim is Michigan State, and 61% in the paint. You compare that, they're shooting just 15 of 53, 28% on mid-range and three-pointers combined. So basically, jump shots have been very bad for them. Inside shots have been very good. For KU, to counter that, you got to show toughness. You got to be strong. Honestly, like, is this a matchup where it does make some sense for KU to throw out a handful of minutes here or there? You know, Zach Clements at the 4. We didn't see him against Carolina with Hunter at the 5, or Clements at the 4, Flory at the 5, even a lineup where Flory and Hunter are playing together for a handful of minutes. This would be the matchup where if it ever were to happen, it would make the most sense. But for KU, just don't get punked on the inside, meet their physicality. The good news is if you're just pairing up, if you're saying, hey, we're going to play two big basketball against your two big basketball, we're going to play with a lot of big men going inside, that kind of plays into what KU wants to do. I think KU has more three-point shooting around it this year with the roster. But if we're just lining up the big men, if you're telling me to rank the group of big men between Hunter Dickinson, Flory Badunga, KJ Adams, Zach Clements, and their guys, Jackson Kohler and Zapala and all these guys, I'm taking Hunter Dickinson first of the lot. The second pick might be KJ Adams. The third pick might be Flory, but I might take KU's top 3 bigs over Michigan State's top big. I don't know. Maybe that's disrespectful for Jackson Kohler and the improvement he's had this season, or Zapala, and we'll wait and see in the game. But point being, I like KU's group of big men better. So if it just comes down to that, then that actually is a good thing for KU. Number 2 is get back on defense. North Carolina loves to get out in transition, and it caused KU some troubles on the defensive end of the court. Guess what Michigan State likes to do? They love to run in transition. That's always kind of been the case with Tom Izzo. They love to get out in transition. So you have to get back in transition, play good transition defense, make sure you're marking guys, mark a trailer 3. And currently Michigan State's averaging 26.5 transition points per game. That ranks in the top 5% of all of college basketball. And almost a third of their points so far this season are coming in transition. That also ranks in the top 5% of college basketball. So for KU, you have to be good and smart about getting back. This also goes into good shot selection. You take bad shots, it's going to lead to big transition buckets the other way. It means being disciplined, knowing who gets who covers who. Prevent any big runs. Like, it's easy when you have a good transition team like Michigan State will have. Their big men are going to run the floor, which means your big men have to run the floor to get the rebound to prevent them from coming at you. But it's also easy for teams who are good in transition to have a quick 7-0 run. And that can quickly turn the tide in a game, especially in a situation like the Champions Classic where you're going to have fans of Kentucky and Duke that are there as well that might be rooting against you. You never know. So get back on defense, good transition defense, number 2. Number 3, stick on Frankie Fiddler and Trey Holloman from three-point range. Michigan State's only 9 of 36 from 3. That's 25%. I think some of that is indicative that I don't expect them to be a great shooting team this year, but also, I look at a guy like Frankie Fiddler. He's 1 of 5 from 3 this year. Last year, he was at 4.5 attempts per game, 36%. I expect that number to rise. Holloman is at 33% from 3. He shot 43% last season. Now, that was low volume, so don't totally know what to expect there, but he has the highest three-point attempt rate on the team. And so when you're looking at Michigan State, a team that doesn't have a ton of shooters, basically that means they have less options, a more narrow pathway to them having a good three-point shooting game. It's like Kansas last year, right? What was KU's path to having a good three-point shooting game? It was Johnny Furphy shooting well from 3. It was one of DeJuan Harris or Hunter Dickinson randomly hitting like 2, 3, 4 threes in a game, right? Especially when Kevin McCullough was out. It was Nick Timberlake randomly getting hot, which was kind of hit or miss for a game. There weren't a ton of pathways for KU being a great three-point shooting team last year. Whereas you compare this KU team, it's like, oh, well, okay, Zeke Mayo's not feeling it tonight, but David Coit was, or Rylan Griffen was. They have more pathways this year. That's how I view Michigan State this year. They don't have a ton of pathways. It's like, okay, Fiddler better be shooting, Holloman better be shooting, and they better hope they're going off. So if you're Kansas, chase those guys off the three-point line, because if you can chase them off, there's not a ton of other options for Michigan State from behind the arc. Our player matchup here, we're going to go Jeremy Fears versus DeJuan Harris. I think it's an interesting matchup because of the fact that you have two very similar players. Fears only scoring like 5 points per game, but he's getting 8 assists per game, right? That sounds like the same kind of DeJuan Harris mold of point guard type, right? Where you can be that facilitator. But Fierce is a good player. And I think if you're Kansas, you're DeJuan Harris, can you bother him and force him into extra turnovers and cut the head off the snake, so to speak? And then, if you're DeJuan Harris, he had 10 points, and they came kind of at key moments in the North Carolina games. Choosing your moments of picking and choosing when to score and doing so efficiently. I think you continue to do that if you're DeJuan Harris. Continue to be a good defensive player out there. And I think that'll be a really fun matchup between two like-minded, and I guess you don't always see those types of point guards day and age of college basketball. All right, let's get to our players to watch next. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That is at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL and the Locked On Podcast Network. Continuing on with this episode of Locked On Jayhawks, preview of Kansas, Michigan State. Again, we'll have a KU Michigan State recap. You can also make your second listen today, Locked On College Basketball or Locked On College Football as well. All right, so our Hawks to soar in this one. Let's start with the offensive side of the ball. I'm going to go with Rylan Griffen. When you look at Frankie Fiddler, who plays on the wing for Michigan State, he is their lowest rated defender. I know it's only through 2 games, but on Evan Miyakawa's website. And it's by I would say a decent margin. When you look at the guy who's in first to him being in last, like it's 3 times the amount of defensive BPR that the production is. So when you're looking on the wing here, you're looking for somebody on the wing who can make that pay. And I think Rylan Griffen is that guy. He had a decent game in the North Carolina game. It was only like 6 points, but you're not playing a ton of minutes with the amount of depth KU had, and AJ Storr played well off the bench. But he went, 2 for 4 from 3. Like, he had a good shooting game, which is the main thing that you're asking him to do. So I think he could have a big shooting game in this one. He seems to be somebody who steps up in the big moment. When you look at his like NCAA tournament run, this is obviously a big moment in an NBA arena and everything. And I think it'll be interesting too how KU devolves their lineups. We talked about earlier, this would be the game that makes the most sense to play more 2-big basketball when you look at Michigan State. At the same point in time, there should be certain times where if you're KU, you're sitting there going, hey, let's try to take advantage of the 2-big lineup instead of saying, hey, we're going to play 2-big on 2-big, which again, I like KU's bigs better, so it makes sense to do that. It also probably makes sense at sometimes to be like, hey, let's try to take advantage of it. Let's put Rylan Griffen or AJ Storr or one of these guard wing types at the 4, and if we can hold up on the defensive end on the interior, then we're going to have a huge offensive advantage. Whoever that 4-man is for KU, he's being guarded by a big man at the other end. They're going to be able to get some threes off. And I think Griffen could fall into that line along with Storr and could kind of cook on the perimeter in this game. When I look at the defensive side of the ball, I'm going to say Dickinson / Flory because Michigan State loves to pound it inside, as we've talked about all through the episode. I think these are solid matchups for both, right? Like when I look at Hunter Dickinson, he struggles in space. He struggles guarding guys out on the perimeter, although he did a great job of the last couple of possessions against North Carolina. And I think Bill Self in the postgame had a funny comment about it. It was like something along the lines of like, he made a mistake showing us he could do that on film because now we're going to expect that all the time, which is totally fair. But Hunter struggles more in the like space game. When it's big on big basketball, he's a giant. He's 7'2" with long arms. Like he's going to be good to go when it's somebody trying to post him up, or it's just like pounding on the inside. So like that, for this reason, I think is going to be a good defensive matchup for him, and he can use his strengths. Because at the end of the day, like KU actually ranked pretty well in the defensive end as a team last year in Big 12 play. And Hunter Dickinson's final year at Michigan, I think in Big 10 only games, they were like number 1 or number 2 in Big 10 only games in defensive efficiency on KenPom. So like, he can do some good things defensively. It's more of the teams like North Carolina that exploit that. I don't think that's as much in this game. So I think a big game for him with Flory. I think if you're coming inside a lot, good opportunity to get some shot blocks. Obviously, the big thing when you have a team that's compounded inside, when you have a freshman center like Flory is going to come in, the question becomes, do you get in foul trouble? And that'll be the big thing for KU. Can you avoid foul trouble overall for Hunter and Flory? If you do, I think you're going to feel all right with where this one goes. All right, that'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page. We'll be back to break down whatever happens between the Jayhawks and the Spartans on our next episode of Locked On Jayhawks.